Hello, my name is Thomas. Welcome to British Culture. Albion Never Dies. I have just read all 7 Harry Potter books for the first time, plus 3 supplementary books. I've played the Hogwarts Legacy game, I've been watching the movies, and I'm reading up on J.K. Rowling's deep lore writings originally hosted on the Pottermore websites. This has been my first real exposure to the Harry Potter universe, aside from watching the movies which came out more than 20 years ago. The Philosopher's Stone being released in 2001. I enjoyed it in Turkish Cyprus with my mother, who greatly enjoyed it. I was a Star Wars fan, and still am, so I'm familiar with the Joseph Campbell's hero's journey, and I saw a lot of that in the first film, but I found the second much more interesting, but neither of them really prompted me to read the books. This may be because I was living in a non-English speaking country at the time, so the Harry Potter phenomenon largely passed our country by, or at least it was of notably lesser intensity than anything I've heard of in the UK and the US. Of course, it could also be a matter of age. I was a little too old, a bit older than the target age group, and to be fair, I couldn't tell you what the current phenomenon is, gripping children. It's not really part of my world. Some of that shows how our personal experiences shape our perception of pop culture. It's often said that your favourite James Bond film is like a Rorschach test, saying much more about you than the film itself. There's also a tendency for your favourite Bond actor to match whoever you're watching on screen at a formative age. So of course that is normally determined by how old you are. And much the same could be said about your favourite iteration of Sherlock Holmes. If it's Benedict Cumberbatch, the chances are that you are younger than whoever in your life favours Jeremy Brett. And if your favourite Sherlock Holmes is Roger Moore, I suspect that says even more about you. So, in this podcast, I'll talk about my own experience of Harry Potter, so you can get a handle on where I'm coming from. I'll give you my spoiler-free review of each book, and talk a little bit about the takeaways of British culture I've had from each. After all, the guiding question of this podcast is, what is Britishness? Finally, I'll give my final recommendation for the Potterverse, again, in line with my own experience, so what's good for you may well depend on how much your experience matches mine. And a quick disclaimer, I'm not a Potterhead or Harry Potter expert, but I did enjoy immersing myself in this world for the last 6 months or so. So, me, myself and I. My very first exposure to Harry Potter was on Boxing Day in the year 2000, when BBC Radio 4 cancelled all programming to broadcast an 8-hour reading of Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone, famously retitled Sorcerer's Stone in the USA, read by Stephen Fry. All the radios were on in our house, and it was a good background as we moved around on Boxing Day and did our own thing throughout the day, but I can't claim to remember specifics of the story, just that I liked the author's writing and Stephen Fry's voice. So my first time really focusing on it was when the movie came out, 2001, by which time I was living with my parents in Turkish Cyprus, far, far away from Pottermania. So when it came out and I saw it in the cinema, there were just 5 people in the cinema, myself, my mother, and 3 random girls I didn't know. Although, of course, that was a day showing, so maybe later showings would have more, but our cinemas are very small, perhaps holding 30 or maybe 40 people. Now, my mother, who passed away last year, was very, very taken with the film, and she really enjoyed it. She talked about it a lot. And my friends and neighbours in Turkish Cyprus told me how I looked absolutely identical to Harry, since his colouring and mine are pretty unusual out there. There's no great resemblance, I believe, between myself and Daniel Radcliffe, but we are at least the same ethnicity, and this has followed me around for a while. I'd hear the same thing from Arabs and Chinese in recent years, to varying degrees. The films reaching China much more than they did the Arabian Gulf, especially where I was, in, of course, very conservative Saudi Arabia. But even in China, the Potterverse didn't have a great cultural purchase. They're more interested in their own kids' stuff, like The Monkey King. So it's there, not huge. If they think of something British, it might be Harry Potter. I'm British, therefore they'd often mention it to me. Anyway, since my mother did enjoy the films, and she lived overseas for the last 20 years of her life, I would always buy her the DVD of the latest film when it was coming out, often for Christmas, wherever I could get it, and we'd watch them on Boxing Day, and sometimes we'd watch it a few more times. Now, she found the later ones a touch too dark, whereas I found the world building increasingly interesting, but due to gaps between the films, I'd find some of the latter ones hard to follow. Now, I admitted this when working with a group of people, all just a bit younger than me, and they'd spent their entire lives in the UK and had very definitely not escaped this phenomenon. So I suddenly found myself surrounded by deep lore experts desperate to share their knowledge. This holds in my memory more than the final 4 films, that and my mother's enjoyment of the first few films. She also loved the book Beedle the Bard by J.K. Rowling, which I didn't trouble myself with until, well, just a few days ago. Anyway, given that I have a podcast on Britishness, given how much it clearly connects to people around the world as a very British thing, I decided it was time to sit down and read them for myself. Now, first things first. I knew there were 4 houses in the school, but I couldn't name them. The reason perhaps it stayed in my mind is because it was much the same with most schools I went to, whether it was an unusually expensive school or whether it was just a regular normal school. They'd all had pretty much the same house points, they'd all had pretty much the same colours but different names, so that aspect of Harry Potter was reassuringly familiar to me. I'd normally been sorted into whatever is yellow. So I went to the Harry Potter website and took the sorting app quiz, which put me into Hufflepuff, whose motto is dedication, patience and loyalty. Fine. I didn't really mind what it was. I just wanted a horse to bet on in terms of a house. You know, if you watch a horse race, it's often more interesting if you put a penny bet on one of the horses. You've got a thread to follow. So then I started a video game, Hogwarts Legacy, which also had a sorting ceremony near the beginning, and that put me into Hufflepuff. So when it came to buying the book, I got the special 20th Anniversary House Edition, which is in black and yellow, and it has the Hufflepuff crest on it, and some special pages talking about the house and people in it. On the first page, it told me that Hufflepuffs were described as a lot of duffers by Hagrid. So they're described as duffers. Oh well. Oh well, but I was committed, so I played the video game as Hufflepuff, and I read the first book, Hufflepuff themed. I have since been told by absolutely everyone I know with any scant knowledge of the Harry Potter universe, even those who've never read the books but grew up on the films, that I am a Ravenclaw. Now, one guy at work, I just started to say I'm reading the Harry Potter books. He interrupted me and just said, Ravenclaw, you're Ravenclaw. Since they're supposed to be clever, I suppose it is kind of a compliment. And when I learned that they are highly individualistic, for example, Luna, one of the very few characters outside the main 3 I remembered was a Ravenclaw, I must admit, I did start to see people's point, but my bet had been made, and for better or worse, I'd focus on the Hufflepuffs as I played the game and read the books. They're also said to be quite caring, and I was caring for my father at that time, more than usual, so I played the game first, but I'll talk about that more in detail later. The first book I read, conventionally, was Year 1, The Philosopher's Stone. Now, my main takeaway from this first book was just how well written it was. It was just solid. It flowed really well, but what also struck me was how long it took to get to Hogwarts School. Chapter 7 marks the arrival at the school out of 17 chapters. It's also very short. I think I could have read it in a long afternoon, but I read it in 2 sittings. Each character was well drawn, own ideas, own motivations. I could imagine them outside their own individual scene, even if they're just in there for one scene. But it's also told very, 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 very much from Harry's perspective, much more than I expected. Rewatching the movie, I was struck perhaps inevitably by how young the child stars were, and how closely the movie follows the book. Very, very little details might be missing, but for the most part I was impressed with how direct the book-to-screen adaptation was. Year 2, The Chamber of Secrets. So these books, they can be sold in house sets, but I was keen to have one book from each house, so the next one I got was Ravenclaw. Now, this was not because people were saying that I was a Ravenclaw. I hadn't actually told anyone that I was reading them at this point. I got Ravenclaw because I assumed Gryffindor would be the easiest to get, being their hero house, and Slytherin after that, edgy kids wanting it, so the remaining houses would be the scarcest. So, equally, the earlier books would be the most plentiful, due to the inevitable readership dropout over the series. So it's more to do with my strategy of buying than anything else. Year 2 was Ravenclaw. So, book itself, I enjoyed it immensely, much more than the first. This is probably because instead of taking time to build the world, J.K. Rowling could now get on with it. She could just set an adventure within it, and I enjoyed it as a much more self-contained fantasy universe. Something I really enjoyed was how she combined character and the little extra world building she does here. A lot of fantasy authors, when they stop to explain a spell, object, idea, creature and so on, it just slows the narrative down. But Rowling uses each fantasy object to reveal something about the person explaining it. Since it's pretty much all told from Harry's perspective, we learn as he learns, and often what he learns, it explains previous oddities and previous mysteries, including from the previous book. I really like how she seeds ideas and story threads, creates lots of little mysteries that get tied up, wrapped up, solved a little bit later on. I also started to understand why the yellow and blue houses seem lesser known. Naturally, we learn about the hero's house and his rivals, as they must often share certain classes together. Gryffindor and Slytherin are paired for certain classes, whilst Ravenclaw and Hufflepuff are paired for those same classes. Naturally, the highest achieving student in each house would have a rivalry with those high achievers in the house that they're often paired with. Again, film and book largely match, although the books are significantly better at showing Hogwarts as, well, a functioning school. Rowling was an English teacher in Portugal. She wrote the first chapter of Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone, while in Portugal that was the Mirror of Erised chapter. I can see how the experience as an ESL teacher influenced the books. I am qualified, indeed a teacher trainer, so looking at how she describes the students, the function of the school, and simple things like the reuse of materials. New teachers, inexperienced teachers, will often create a lot of materials that they'll use once, whereas an experienced teacher will create a material that can be used in lots of different ways, and Rowling does that quite a lot. Ideas are introduced, given use and reused in interesting ways later on. I really like that. So I did see how this was written by an English teacher, and incidentally, I would say that most of my memories of the film came from this far, 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 far more than the first, and that's probably because the world is better explored. The third book is The Prisoner of Azkaban. Now this time I got the Slytherin edition because it was one of the two houses I didn't get, and I think this one is, in the house version, the cheapest. So again, it's got the black and green, it's got the special pages, it's got the coloured pages and so on. I really enjoyed getting those special editions. I actually had no recollection of the contents whatsoever, so that didn't influence my decision which house to get. Reading it, especially the section with the Shrieking Shack and Mr. Lupin, I did remember the film, as I think Remus Lupin had been a favourite of mine when I watched the film. Reading the book, I was actually surprised what a major character the Prisoner of Azkaban was, and the impact he made on Harry. I definitely gravitated towards Lupin in the books, who's a relatively minor character. He's definitely one of the supporting cast, and I did when watching the films originally. That's probably just my own interest. Having read the books and watched the films, if I had a choice of having a coffee with Harry Potter at any age, James Potter, his father, The Prisoner of Azkaban, or Remus Lupin, I'd definitely choose Lupin, as long as he was fully himself. Anyway, it's this book which starts for me to have a marked difference between page and screen, and part of that is simply length. So my copy of book 1 was 331 pages, book 3 is 462, and that does make a difference, most especially on world building, explaining how kind of A gets to B, the role of secondary characters. The films always focus on Harry, but part of his journey in the books is learning about the multi-dimensional characters and complex relationships of those around him, children and adults. He is also, at times, a far less sympathetic character, which I found very interesting. Ron, his friend, is much more of a mentor character, which makes sense given that unlike Harry and Hermione, he's grown up knowing all about the magical world. He knows the movers and shakers in it. I wouldn't say he's a totally different character, but the shift in emphasis is, for me, very, very discernible. Now, The Goblet of Fire. This is the first book I can remember hearing about. It was released in the year 2000, and I can remember news reports of school children lining up to get this book. There's a huge amount of publicity, enough for it to get on the main news, which is impressive for a 617-page children book. At least that's the length, again, of my anniversary edition, this time in Gryffindor. So now I have all 4 houses represented on my shelf with their special covers, sprayed edges and house colours. and a few relevant pages to the house in question. I really like them. I was just picking up on eBay, and as with the previous book, the length led to an increasing gulf between the book and the film. In fact, rewatching the film, I found certain jump cuts, especially near the start, a little bit off-putting. I watched it surprised at how little I remembered of the film, and I guess that's because my mother and I didn't put this in the DVD player too often. The book is definitely better than the film, although I had a distant memory of J.K. Rowling being interviewed 25 years ago now, explaining that she'd started with a simple enough plan, but that it didn't quite work out, so it was written in a more flow of consciousness kind of way than the previous three, which had followed her initial plan quite closely. Some of that did come across. Lots and lots of machinations are needed to get characters to where they're needed, in the state they needed to be in, with all the knowledge and understanding to make the plot just work, which may sound like a criticism, but I was definitely enjoying it. It was not a grind. I was enjoying it above and beyond most books I've read, and I was even just starting to get up a little earlier than usual so I could turn the page, get a few more questions answered. I liked the focus on how students other than Harry Potter felt about events, and how unpopular he was at times, even though it was told, again, very, very, very much from his point of view. Again, I liked the reuse of locations, ideas, spells, but each time with a new and different spin or consequence. It was never the same thing. It was yes, but, or yes, and that deepened my enjoyment of the world she was creating. Everything in the book seemed a lot more involved than the film. It's a lot more convoluted, things progress more logically and more satisfactorily as a result, even though the film is 2 hours and 42 minutes. Again, very long for a kid's film. This is very long for a kid's book. For Year 5, I got The Order of the Phoenix in Hufflepuff edition. Nice, although I realised that would have been better for the previous book as well. I'm currently wearing my Hufflepuff scarf, as that's the house I was sorted into, the one I've kind of chosen to go with. I've also got a Hufflepuff Quidditch jumper that I couldn't resist, which is actually really good quality and quite warm. Anyway, The Order of the Phoenix. This is 800 pages. This is this is a pretty solid kids' book. I guess a kids' book. I must admit, until this point, I hadn't really noticed much change in style. Now, I'd heard many, many, many times that the books grow up with Harry, but the voice overall had remained to me much more consistent than I'd expected. Some grown-up themes had been present in the last book or two, but nothing too striking for me. This is the book where the change of tone became marked. It's also the book where I was getting up about an hour earlier than usual to read before work and spent a couple of evenings buried in. I also made the largest number of bookmarks, anticipating at this point that I might create a podcast on it. I hadn't been too sure until this point. I was just reading it for my own satisfaction. I was interested, I said I'd mention a few notes of Britishness. I was interested that both Hermione and Cho, a possible love interest for Harry, drink coffee, which I found interesting. Tea would have been more stereotypically English, and Harry does indeed drink tea. Again, with the films, we're getting a pretty large gulf here for me, and I was a bit disappointed when I saw the film. Having read the book, they didn't show more of Neville's story. I mean, they did show a bit, but just a little bit more would have been much nicer for me. The opening of the film takes Harry along to the title organisation, the Order of the Phoenix, in the first 15 minutes or so, but in the book the period is much, 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 much longer. Equally, the fact that he's just a kid who's now had adults trying to kill him. He's seen horrific attacks on people around him and is being mistreated quite unfairly, but quite believably by those in authority. We see how it's taken his toll. We see how he's short-tempered, impatient with others. This is kind of shown a bit in the film, but I think the book explores it much, much better. Book 6, The Half-Blood Prince. I feel lucky. At no point in reading this had I any recollection of who the Half-Blood Prince was. That's the major mystery throughout the book. If you don't know, don't Google it. I think it's better not to know. I somehow managed to avoid spoilers, even though I had definitely watched the film when it came out in 2009, or at least that December 2009. I remember getting the DVD just in time to give it to my mother when I flew out to see her overseas. I remember getting that particular DVD being, as Wellington said of Waterloo, a very close-run thing. Now, I looked to get the house editions, but the cost was simply higher than I was willing to pay. So I got the adult edition, but then wrapped it in my own special dust jacket. I haven't mentioned this, but on various trips I was making at the time down to London, I popped in each time at platform 9 3/4, since my train from Yorkshire, where I live, always goes down to King's Cross, which is where the kids take the Hogwarts Express. And at the shop, platform 9 3/4, I bought various treats there. I got a butterbeer, a kind of butterscotch flavoured drink, and they wrapped it in the Daily Prophet newspaper. That's the wrapping paper. That's the Wizarding World's rag. So I had homemade dust jacket that was on theme. I used that newspaper when I was back home to create a dust jacket. Ultimately, this worked for the best for the last 2 books, which I did this for, because they're less and less and less to do with school and houses and much more to do with the adult world anyway, as Harry comes of age. Now for the last one I made lots and lots of bookmarks. This one, very, very few, mainly because I was completely and utterly engrossed. It's hard to choose a favourite, but if I had a favourite book, it would probably be this one, despite my zero memory of the associated film. Don't judge a book by its film. As far as the other treats, by the way, I tried the chocolate frog, which I found startlingly solid. I was expecting it to be quite hollow and to crumble easily, but more of an effort than I expected to smash it apart. Very good quality chocolate, and I was actually really happy to get the wizard card of Ollivander, who appears in the first book for the first time. I really enjoyed his character in the film and in the book. I also got the Bertie Bott's Every Flavour Bean, which is a thing from the films and books, but this had just too many gross flavours for an adult to enjoy a packet of it, unless I was really, really unlucky. I can see how it's really good fun for a group of kids, kind of getting each other to try them at random, but my favourite was the Fizzing Whizbees, which was a more reasonably sized piece of chocolate with popping candies inside them. I really enjoyed that one. But it was fun to have these treats as I was watching the films, made it more of a thing, you know? Okay. The final book in the mainline series is The Deathly Hallows. Again, my personal dust jacket on this adult edition, and again, it gives me a reason to get out of bed early in the morning. At this point, my wife was very much noticing my early starts. I'm not normally a morning person, far from it, but for reading Harry Potter, I was very willing to do it. First of all, I was very impressed. Chapter 1 of Book 7, Rowling gives a fantastic and highly original recap of the story so far. Now, she does this in a way that introduces new ideas, characters, concepts, moves things along, and it felt fresh, even though I was going straight from one book to the next. The opening chapter, I think, should be studied in how to do the story so far in absolutely any series. The second thing I really liked was to do with the broad direction of the series. So far, Harry's been introduced to magic, the school, learn more about it, learn more about his friends, his family, allies, and yes, enemies. The world has gotten very, very broad. But for this final book, even though the war in the Wizarding World is well portrayed and can fill certainly my imagination, the book delves right down into Harry and his nearest and dearest in a very tight, disciplined, focused way, without leaving me feel shortchanged of the world at large. I'd often wondered how satisfying I'd find the ending of the 7-book series, especially as I have only the loosest recollections of these later films. This book is split into 2 films. It's this one that's something of a committee explaining to me after I'd seen it, which I honestly enjoyed more than watching the film. There's nothing like having people explain their true and deep passions to you. In the end, all I could say was I was completely satisfied. So much so my first reaction upon finishing was A, thinking I should restart at the Order of the Phoenix, and the last 3 are by far my favourites, and B, gosh, I need to find a new reason to get up in the mornings. So these were the 7 books that are like a mainline Harry Potter story, which I very, very, very much enjoyed. The more I read, the more I enjoyed. Simple as that. But there were 3 extra books. Fantastic Beasts, A History of Quidditch, and Beedle the Bard. These are books that are referred to in the 7 Harry Potter books. They're variously textbooks or children's books that the main characters come across. And so J.K. Rowling wrote them. Fantastic Beasts was the first kind of extra book I got, one of the 3. I have seen the Fantastic Beasts films. I thought they were fun, but I haven't revisited them. The book is a very simple A to Z, or A to Z, of the various creatures in the Potterverse, and it's kind of like a school textbook, really. in many ways, it is a perfect bathroom book, light read, toilet book. Very little investment needed, no connection really to the various entries apart from the kind of theme, overall topic. You can dip in, dip out, enjoy the creative descriptions and funny little anecdotes. I really enjoyed this. I enjoyed this the most out of any of the 3 supplementary books. Top place. The second supplementary book was a history of Quidditch. I must admit, any book on sport is very lucky to get my attention, even one with broomsticks and enchanted rocks. Still, I enjoyed the cod history and the little nuggets, such as the team in Ilkley, West Yorkshire, and I can imagine a Quidditch stadium up on the moor there. I've often been to Betty's tea shop and gone up to the moor and so on. Anyway, the history of Quidditch, with its curious history, fanatical cult following, weird and arcane rules and nonsensical scoring system, seemed almost indistinguishable to me from cricket. I imagine this was entirely intentional, but I think it was the least favourite of the 3 supplementary books, but still bronze. Bronze is still a medal. Beedle the Bard. Beedle the Bard. My mother had often talked about this book, which I'd bought for her, but I hadn't read it in her lifetime. She had read it, and the few times it came up when I flew out to see her tended to be when she remembered it, and therefore started reading a section. So as with the previous 2, it's a very, very, very short book. It's often referred to in universe, inside the 7 mainline books. Probably the least suitable as a bathroom book, but great to read before bed, as they are bedtime fairy tales for little witches and little wizards in the Harry Potter universe. I greatly enjoyed the originality. I was quite intrigued to know if J.K. Rowling had a dislike for Beatrix Potter. There seemed to be a swipe or 2 at her writings in a couple of places. Given Rowling's most famous creation shares her name, perhaps the dislike is a little overstated here. If you do know, do send me a message, albionneverdies@gmail.com, or Instagram at Fleming Never Dies. Anyway, I did enjoy them, and they do tie in very, 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 very closely to the final book, as it's the book Hermione reads at one point, and she reads out a section. I said I'd talk about this towards the end. Hogwarts Legacy. I actually bought this game in the middle of last year to keep me busy as I waited for the release of another game on my PlayStation. My intention was to play Hogwarts Legacy just a little bit and then drop it as and when. I thought it'd be a good introduction to the world that I was curious to learn about, being a little wary of kind of picking up these children's books because you'll never see it as an adult in the same way a child does. On the point that Hogwarts Legacy is a good introduction, I'd say that's entirely correct. The story follows a character who's developed magic late in life, so he's 15 or 16 years old. It's set in the year 1890, so the school hasn't changed, not much, but we aren't burdened with pre-existing characters and relationships. It's essentially a familiar place, but a fresh slate. On the point of this being a game I could easily pick up and drop whenever, that was absolutely half right. It was a bit clunky at first, and as a casual gamer I kind of blamed myself, then downloaded the largest update for a game I've ever had, and from that point on it flowed smoothly and beautifully. Very easy to pick up, very difficult to put down. It just drew me in more and more and more. I love this character whose magic develops late because it's an unusual type of magic, but most of the spells he used would be regular magic, and I would use them a lot in the game, and then a few months later as I start to read the books, I'm familiar with all those bits of magic as they come up in the books. I can visualise them much more easily. It was a good combination. Now, I'd actually suggest this, if you do play a game to any level whatsoever, because as I say, I'm a very, very casual gamer, I'd suggest this is the ideal introduction to the world of Hogwarts. Slightly more grown-up story, strong enough main story to provide direction and interest, enough side quests to give the open world shape and something to do. As I said, I found it very, very satisfying. I could play for 20 minutes on a side quest, or a couple of hours on the main quest, depending on what else I had to do that week. And if you're not interested in this at all, I would still suggest the ambient music, which you can find on YouTube quite easily. Great for having on in the background as you either do a household task or read the Harry Potter books. Now, as part of my work, I actually chatted to the board director of Warner Brothers, who oversaw the diversity elements of this game, and as a result of this I ended up noticing these elements much more than I usually would. Hogwarts is of course a British school. There is Ilvermorny in America, Beauxbatons in France, Durmstrang somewhere in Northern Europe. By the way, contrary to the films, these are all both gendered schools. There's no single-sex Bo Baxtons or single-sex Durmstrang. For some reason, that's the way they're shown in the films. But anyway, these are mixed schools. As a desirable school in 1890, it's notable that the diversity element is mainly provided by those from Africa and South Asia. In other words, it matches the connections the UK had in the Muggle, non-magic world. I quite enjoyed this little detail. In the real world, Eton had students from British India the decade before this game was set, so it's not an unreasonable inclusion, even though playing the game it might seem like what some people call a Tiffany problem. A Tiffany problem, or the Tiffany effect, is where historical details seem somehow unrealistic for the time to modern audiences, despite it being genuine. The example being the name Tiffany sounds very modern to most of us, but it's a medieval name. It's perfectly reasonable to have somebody in the 14th century, 12th century called Tiffany, in the same way that sometimes in a period drama you have a 19th century character with sepia-toned photographs on display, because a strong black and white contrast seems somehow modern, but in reality old photos were black and white in the 19th century and turned sepia decades later. Before this game is set in 1887, Queen Victoria's Golden Jubilee particularly highlighted South Asian connections. So the Queen had a contingent of cavalry from the British Indian Army brought to London to be her personal escort, and she had waiters to princes. India was specially celebrated, both Hindu and Muslim. In the real world, the largest Hindu library in the world, outside India, was in London, so it's not unreasonable to suggest the average Brit's knowledge of the subcontinent was larger at this time than it is now. Have a read of Lawrence James or Jan Morris or even Rudyard Kipling for an insight into this. So this diversity element, as I say, is highlighted for me because I happen to be talking to the board director as part of my work. He talked about this and I noticed it in the game and actually really enjoyed it. So, to conclude, Harry Potter has been a fantastic universe to delve into for a few months. I very much enjoyed Hogwarts Legacy, the game, and I'm often returning to it. I enjoyed all 7 Harry Potter books, belting through the first few, slowing down for the Goblet of Fire, and then loving the final 3 especially. I'm enjoying rewatching the films, and I'm impressed at how well they hold up, especially how well cast the child actors are, and of course the adults. It's an all-star lineup of British acting talent. I've enjoyed drinking the butterbeer and fizzing Whizbees, slightly lower ranking for the chocolate frog, and much lower for the jelly beans. I've also, as I mentioned, been to some of the Harry Potter locations from King's Cross, although I was going anyway. Leadenhall Market, which is where you go to get to the leaking cauldron at the beginning of the first film. But anyway, I wasn't going there, but it was just a really nice place to go. I've also been to Durham Cathedral, which is a location used for the Hogwarts school courtyard, and the Transfiguration classroom at Durham Cathedral for the first 2 films, and it's just a brilliant place to visit anyway. I've also popped by the location of Hogsmeade Station, again the train station that's nearest Hogwarts School, seen in the first film. That's actually Goathland Railway in North Yorkshire, and again, it's just a gorgeous location in itself. So from locations to reading books to playing games, wearing the scarf and the jumper, all these different things have made this a really fun experience. As I don't know if it's going to be a lifelong thing, but I really, really enjoyed the experience, and I've had some pretty happy memories delving into Harry Potter.